You know, it doesn't take much living to recognize there's something really wrong with this place. And it really leaves you wondering if there's any hope that somebody's ever going to set the universe right. They say that life is short, and the more I find myself inching toward the finish line, the more I tend to agree with that sentiment. In fact, from where I sit right now, the finish line seems painfully close, even though it feels like I was a little kid just a few days ago. In fact, I remember my kindergarten career like it was yesterday. I was living in a tiny northern British Columbia town tucked away behind the Alaska Panhandle, a tiny community that had a considerable number of Dutch immigrants. And I went to kindergarten at Walnut Park Elementary. I was the only boy in my carpool, and back in those days, the boys and girls would line up at different school entrances every morning, waiting to be let inside. Now, given that I was shy and I didn't know any of the boys, during that first week of kindergarten, I lined up with the kids I actually knew, the girls from my carpool, until the teachers found me there and sent me around to the other side of the building to go and stand with the rest of the boys. But you know, maybe the most vivid memory I have is the day that my teacher confiscated my comic book. It was a special Robin Hood Digest, the Disney version of Robin Hood where the characters were all animals. Robin Hood was a fox and Little John was a bear. And I guess one day my class assignment was so boring, I pulled this comic book out and I started to read. And that's when the teacher confiscated it and I never got it back. And I've got to tell you, that little incident bothered me for the next 5 decades. I know it seems like a small thing, a 50-cent comic book, but it felt like a grave miscarriage of justice. Now I realize I probably had it coming. I mean, I was that kid who was always busy doing something other than what you were told to do. You know, not doing what the teacher asked, talking to my neighbor, daydreaming, doodling on the edges of my notebook, or just plain being disgruntled about spending the bulk of my day the way someone else thought I should. And the problem wasn't that I wasn't interested in education, because I was. I still am to this day. I think for me, the problem was having somebody else set my agenda. Now, of course, when we're 5, most of us need to be told what to learn because we have no idea what the world is like or what we're going to need in order to become successful adults. In fact, I somehow doubt that most of us really know what we need until well into adulthood when we're actually faced with the reality of life. But now back to the comic book. Having it taken from me really bothered me for the next 50 years. And that's when it occurred to me that the world is a very big place, which means that somebody probably had a copy of that same comic for sale on eBay. So I hunted for it. And sure enough, for $8 I found it the other day, and it came in the mail. I was so excited that I posted a picture of this comic in a private online forum that I have for my friends, and that's when my cousin's wife suddenly says, "Oh man, I understand your pain. Back in the first grade, I had my lunchbox stolen and I had to brown bag it from that point forward." So I went back to eBay and I hunted for her lunchbox. And sure enough, it was there. And you know, I should probably ask eBay to sponsor this show because now I'm guessing some of you are about to start hunting for your missing childhood treasures. So eBay, maybe you should cough up a little cash because I'm not going to endorse you for nothing. But again, back to my comic book, because there's an important reason I'm bringing this up. What exactly drives our sense of justice? I know this is going to sound silly, but the day this comic book arrived in the mail, I felt like a deep injustice had been made right, and that somehow the universe was back in balance again. I know, it's just a 50-cent item. And if I lost it myself, it probably wouldn't have bothered me. But it was taken from me at the tender age of 5. And this was easily one of my most prized possessions. So why is it that losing this comic bothered me for so many years? Why is it after the age of 50 that I can still look back to that story and still feel this raw sense of indignation? Where exactly Do we get the idea that wrongs need to be righted or that people owe us something when they transgress our personal boundaries? I mean, where exactly did I get this idea that my teacher owed me something? It's not like we all take a class when we're 3 years old explaining the rules of social conduct and social justice. We just seem to be aware of it naturally. Of course, our parents do a lot to help create that instinct because the process of discipline begins the moment we're born. For example, there comes a point where a baby realizes that if he cries in the night, he gets held by his mother. And at some point, the parents get tired of doing that. So the next time they check on the baby, if there's nothing wrong, no dirty diaper, no need to be fed, they don't pick him up. And eventually, the baby learns that you're not allowed to manipulate people. So there's no doubt that we begin learning the rules of social conduct at a really, really young age. But still, most people seem to have this ingrained sense of justice that runs deeper than that. Some of it probably stems from the fact that we're wired for survival, and the only perspective that most of us have in this world is a selfish perspective. We want to accumulate enough resources to guarantee our own personal well-being. And when somebody takes some of our resources from us, it rubs our fur the wrong way. We feel hard done by. But again, I think there's something deeper than that, because it also bothers us when we see somebody else being served a large helping of injustice. We read stories about people who get cheated, and it upsets us. We hear stories about people who were murdered or robbed or publicly embarrassed, and, well, it really gets our goat. And of course, social scientists have expended considerable effort trying to explain that, and philosophers like Thomas Hobbes have written massive tomes about the nature of social contracts, explaining that we'd probably live in a constant state of war with each other if we didn't create binding rules that help us live together peaceably. And all of that makes sense. It really does. But I still think there's something deeper at play when it comes to our inborn sense of justice. You know, lately I've been reading a lot of ancient history about the northern Germanic peoples, the so-called Vikings. And one of the things that keeps coming up over and over and over is the fact that a lot of their social values centered on the concept of revenge. 1,000 years ago or more, the family unit was the most important element of their society, and kinship was a really, really important concept. If somebody cheated one of your family members or killed them, it was up to you to make that right. It wasn't good enough to just let bygones be bygones. You had to make it right. And that's a concept you actually find in the Bible, where it was assumed that if you killed somebody, you could expect their family members to come and seek revenge. But if it was an accident, there were several cities of refuge where you could go, and nobody could touch you, at least not until there'd been an inquiry to determine whether or not your actions were premeditated. So we had this widespread recognition that there's a huge difference between deliberately planning to kill someone and doing it by accident. And that still makes sense to most of us. And now I've managed to accidentally kill enough time that we've got to take a break. So I'll be right back after this.
Life can throw a lot at us. Sometimes we don't have all the answers. But that's where the Bible comes in. It's our guide to a more fulfilling life. Here at the Voice of Prophecy, we've created the Discover Bible Guides to be your guide to the Bible. They're designed to be simple, easy to use, and provide answers to many of life's toughest questions. And they're absolutely free. So jump online now, or give us a call and start your journey of discovery.
Just before the break, I was talking about our notions of justice and the way the ancient biblical world provided for some nuance. And I was talking about the biblical cities of refuge. Here's the actual passage now as it's found in the book of Exodus. It says, "He who strikes a man so that he dies shall surely be put to death. However, if he did not lie in wait, but God delivered him into his hand, then I will appoint for you a place where he may flee." Now, you may not be of the persuasion that capital punishment is ever right, but just put that aside for one moment and consider the way this passage just differentiates between various kinds of murder. If you killed somebody on purpose, it was considered a far more serious crime. But if it was accidental, the Bible provided for a cooling off period. It pushed the pause button until the facts could be examined. And really, this is something we still do today. Our legal system still draws a huge difference between murder one and manslaughter. You'll notice the penalties are generally different. And there's something about that that appeals to our inborn sense of justice. We all seem to know that intent behind an action matters. And this is something you'll find across a huge number of cultures. And of course, you've got to wonder why. Here in the Western world, our notions of justice owe a lot to the Greek philosopher Aristotle, who spent a lot of time considering what is considered to be fair and equal. In the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle divides the concept of justice into distributive justice, which deals with how people get their fair share, and rectificatory justice, which deals with making wrong things right. And as you read through his material, you quickly discover that a single universal notion of justice is really hard to define. How do you know what's fair? How exactly do you determine if justice has been proportional? He writes a lot of pages wrestling with questions we still continue to struggle with to this day. And if you've ever spent any time reading Aristotle, you'll know that he's very concerned with things like categories and definitions. And that can make the reading more than a little bit tedious. And I suppose I'll leave the finer nuances of Aristotle's arguments to judges and lawyers, because what I actually want to do today is drill down deeper and figure out why we care about justice in the first place. And maybe the best place to turn is one of the oldest books in the world, the book of Job. What we find in this book is a righteous man who endures an awful lot of wrong. And as the book first opens, the reader is the only one who knows what's actually going on. There's a controversy in heaven, and it spills over into Job's life. Let's just read a little bit from the opening chapter. It says, "There was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job, and that man was blameless and upright, and one who feared God and shunned evil." So we're starting with a blameless and upright man, and somehow we instinctively know that if bad things happen to a guy like this, well, that's not right. It's a miscarriage of justice. Somehow we know that good people don't deserve bad things. And thus, the next 40 chapters really bother us because Job's life just begins to fall apart. And what happens behind the scenes is this. The devil appears in a heavenly council, and he proudly declares that this earth belongs to him. That's what it means when the story tells us that Satan has been going to and fro on the earth and walking back and forth on it. He's publicly declaring ownership of this planet, which is theologically accurate because according to the biblical story, the human race actually ceded dominion over this planet to him. And that's a key concept when it comes to the Bible's sense of justice. While you and I might choose to believe that we're all innocent victims, the Bible underlines a corporate sense of guilt for us. None of us, no human being, is actually completely innocent. And if you look at the opening verses of this book, you'll see that Job instinctively understands that. It says in chapter 1, back in verses 4 and 5, "And his sons would go and feast in their houses, each on his appointed day, and would send and invite their 3 sisters to eat and drink with them. So it was, when the days of feasting had run their course, that Job would send and sanctify them, and he would rise early in the morning and offer burnt offerings according to the number of them all. For Job said, 'It may be that my sons have sinned and cursed God in their hearts.' Thus Job did regularly." So, what exactly does Job instinctively understand? He understands that everybody is sinful, absolutely everybody. All of us, according to the book of Romans, have fallen short of the glory of God. We are faulty and imperfect. And one of the biggest problems we have is that we appear to be oblivious to that fact. When we look at the world from our own perspective, we can easily point out the faults of everybody else. Their injustices seem really obvious. But somehow, when it comes to our own sins, well, they just don't seem that bad. So it becomes hard for most of us to believe that we might actually be part of the problem. We are also agents of injustice. And I can't begin to tell you how many times I've talked to people from my past and they suddenly bring up some small incident that really didn't make a deep impression on me, but it certainly made an impression on them. When you decided to do such and such, someone once asked me, was that because of something I did? Now, this was something that happened at least a decade in the past, and I had no idea that someone would misinterpret it. And she'd been harboring doubt and resentment because of me for more than a decade. Now, of course, in that case, it was completely unintentional. I had no idea that I'd contributed to her misery. So I think I'll put that one in the manslaughter column because it was accidental. But then I think about times where I put my own interests first at the expense of everybody else. Now, sometimes that's actually necessary. There's nothing particularly wrong with it because there are people in this world who never seem to actually take care of themselves, and they end up having people always take advantage of them. That's not what I'm talking about, because those people should learn to assert themselves. What I'm talking about are those moments when you didn't even consider the other people in the room, and you pounced on the first opportunity to advance self. And that can absolutely lead to a lot of injustice and a lot of hard feelings. And honestly, you'd be lying if you told me you'd never done it, because we all have, both wittingly and unwittingly. So the Bible underlines this idea that there's something flawed with our human existence, and every one of us is a problem. In one of those little books of John down near the end of the Bible, it says this: if we say that we have no sin, we deceive ourselves, and the truth is not in us. If we say that we have not sinned, we make him a liar, and his word is not in us. Now, you'll notice I inserted a few ellipses into that passage, and in a moment, I'll come back and we'll look at the rest of it. But for now, here's what I want you to notice. The Bible says there is no such thing as an innocent person. And instinctively, we kind of all get that because it's easy to see serious flaws in everybody else. Not to drag up an overused example, but somehow we all know that a man like Hitler needs to answer for what he did. We wouldn't be happy if we knew that somehow the universe was just going to let him skate. But when it comes to our own transgressions, well, that's a completely different story because you and I are incredibly gifted when it comes to justifying our own actions. So the Bible takes the time to tell us, look, if you think you're not part of the problem, you're lying to yourself. Worse than that, you're calling God a liar because from where He sits, you are clearly guilty. You and I are really good at defending our actions to other people. But somehow we know that if the judgment is real and we found ourselves standing in front of God's throne, our excuses would suddenly melt in the light of truth. I'll be right back after this.
Here at the Voice of Prophecy, we're committed to creating top-quality programming for the whole family, like our audio adventure series, Discovery Mountain. Discovery Mountain is a Bible-based program for kids of all ages and backgrounds. Your family will enjoy the faith-building stories from this small mountain summer camp and town. With 24 seasonal episodes every year and fresh content every week, there's always a new adventure just on the horizon.
We all have this profound sense of justice, and I would argue that we have that sense because the one who made us is just. Our Maker is a profoundly just God. But our personal sense of justice has also been warped by selfishness, which blinds us to the contributions we make to the misery of this world. And what we have in the pages of the Bible is a very important corrective, a call to relearn the art of seeing the world the way that God sees it. The call of the Bible in Micah chapter 6 runs like this. It says, "He has shown you, O man, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you but to do justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God?" Now, that's a verse that makes a lot of sense to most people. And we instinctively see that a world that lived by these principles would be a much nicer place to live. But the part we usually miss is that little bit at the end of the verse that refers to humility. We love the idea of justice for somebody else, and we love the idea of mercy for us. And because very few people are actually humble, we have trouble turning that formula the other way around. We struggle to believe that we deserve justice for our crimes and that other people deserve mercy. And that presents us with something interesting to think about. We love the idea of a just society, and we love the idea of mercy. But how do you make both things happen at the same time? Well, that mostly escapes us, which is one of the reasons I find the Bible so fascinating, because it presents a God who is perfectly just and perfectly merciful at the very same moment. In the 89th Psalm, we find this description of God. It says, "Righteousness and justice are the foundation of your throne. Mercy and truth go before your face." You know, Aristotle did a pretty good job of exploring the concept of justice, but he left an awful lot of unanswered questions, which is why very few people consider the Nicomachean Ethics to be the final word on this subject. It was a useful contribution, to be sure, and personally, I like reading it. But I find the Bible to be far more profound because it forces us to wrestle with the idea of a God who is perfectly just and perfectly merciful at the very same moment. You know, I have no idea how many books have been written about the cross of Christ, but it's got to be in the hundreds of thousands, if not the millions now, because there's something really compelling about what happened there. I mean, in all honesty, Jesus was hardly the only person who was ever crucified. The Romans did that to thousands upon thousands of people. In fact, I know of one occasion where the Roman general Varus crucified 2,000 Jews, right about the time that Jesus was born. And I've also seen estimates that over the years, the Romans crucified more than 250,000 Jews. But still, somehow, the crucifixion of Christ stands apart from all the rest, because the way we understand it, it was the cruel death of a perfectly innocent man. And if you believe the Bible's account the way that I do, and you understand that this was God in human flesh, you quickly comprehend that this was the worst miscarriage of justice in the history of the world. Nobody was less deserving of that kind of cruelty than Jesus, because he was the only perfectly innocent man to ever walk the face of the earth. So what that tells me is that God has not isolated himself from our pain. If you and I have discovered that this world is a profoundly unjust place, then that would hold doubly true for God, because come on, you and I cannot claim perfect innocence. Not even close. And what we find at the cross of Christ, even though it is the grossest act of injustice ever perpetrated, is a display of God's perfect justice and perfect mercy at the very same time. Now, that's not an easy thing to wrap your mind around, which is probably why so many people find the story so irresistible. Here's the way that one 19th century author described it, and this is probably one of my favorite thoughts about the cross. And some of you have actually heard me quote this on other programs, other weeks. She wrote, "Christ was treated as we deserve, that we might be treated as he deserves. He was condemned for our sins in which he had no share, that we might be justified by his righteousness in which we had no share. He suffered the death which was ours, that we might receive the life which was his. With his stripes, we are healed." Now, just try to wrap your head around that idea, and I'll be back in a moment to try and wrap things up. The issue of justice and what constitutes justice is really too big of a subject to tackle in a show that lasts only 28 and a half minutes. I mean, look at all the pages Aristotle devoted to that subject, and look at the mountains of books that have been written since his day. But you know, what we have in the Bible may be the most profound treatment of this subject ever written, because it goes to great lengths to explain a number of really important ideas. First of all, it tells us why we have an inborn sense of justice. If you and I were just the product of a cosmic accident, you might explain our sense of justice as a mere survival instinct. We find anything that blocks our attempt to build a more secure existence to be unjust. Competition between living entities for scarce resources becomes just for some, but then unjust for others. But you know, thinking people understand there's more to the subject than just that. What the Bible explains is that the one who made us is the very definition of justice. And that's why our aberrant behavior poses such a problem to the universe. Our lives have actually become a lie about who our Creator is and what He is like. Secondly, the Bible tells us about a God who loves us and can act mercifully without compromising justice one little bit. I mean, in this world, if a criminal walks away from his crime, his own family might feel a deep sense of relief because now dad isn't going to go to the electric chair. But what seems like mercy to one family is going to seem like a grave injustice to somebody else because, well, the victim's family doesn't have the satisfaction of knowing that the magnitude of the perpetrator's crime has even been recognized. It feels like the life of their loved one has been trivialized. Human beings struggle to combine mercy and justice and do it successfully. But what we have in this book is a God that somehow pulls that off. And I'll admit, this is not an easy read. I mean, if you start to investigate what the Bible actually says, if you pick this book up and read it for yourself, you're going to be reading it for a really long time. I mean, the book of Job continues to explore his situation for 40 more very detailed chapters. You could spend an entire year in that book and not hit the bottom of it. So yeah, the Bible doesn't give us easy answers. But of course, easy answers are never very satisfying. And reading the Bible is somehow deeply satisfying, deeply reassuring, because at the very least, it acknowledges the issues that you and I face every day. And it acknowledges that they are not simple. And the longer you study this, the more you find this deep sense of calm, because while the world despairs of finding real justice or real mercy, you discover that there is an order to the universe that actually makes sense. And you discover a God who promises that He knows how to balance the scales and set things right. A few moments ago, we read that passage from 1 John that tells us we're all guilty, and there's a part I left out. It's this: if we confess our sins, He is faithful and just to forgive us our sins and to cleanse us from all unrighteousness. You know, maybe it's time to just read this book for yourself. I'd be delighted to help you get started. It turns out God recognizes your pain and He's going to give back what was taken from you. Just go to BibleSchools.com where you'll find some incredible free resources as our gift to you. I'm Shawn Boonstra, and this has been Authentic.